Hi, this is your host Swapnil Bhartiya and welcome to another episode Data Driven. As companies are becoming more and more cost efficient, instead of looking at counterproductive cost cutting approach, they are embracing cost efficiency approaches by improving their processes and deploy situations or solutions that are helping them tame costs. In today's episode of Data Driven, Dave Birmingham, Senior Technical Evangelist at SIOS Technology, will walk us through some of the biggest cost cutting approaches, specifically for SQL Server. So let's deep dive into this topic. Gabe, what are the biggest cost considerations are there when migrating SQL Server to the cloud?
Yeah, the biggest cost considerations really come down to just a few things: the licensing, the compute cost, the storage cost, and then data transfer cost. So compute cost can vary based on the instance size selection and pricing models. So both Azure, AWS, and most of the cloud providers offer options to reduce those expenses through, in the Azure case of Azure's Azure reservations, where you prepay for a VM in like 1 or 3 year terms and save you a significant amount of money. And then there's also Azure savings plans where you have more flexibility based upon a committed hourly spend. And same with AWS, you have what they call the compute savings plan. If you commit to a fixed compute spend, and you can use any instance type, or if you know exactly the region and the instance type you're going to use, and it has to be called like a instance AWS EC2 instance savings plan, which can even save you more money. The storage is another critical component. So you have lots of options in the cloud, from premium SSDs and provisioned IOPS, which all can drive up the cost. So really you have to balance the performance versus the expense, and that's the key, is to make sure you're not over provisioning, but also provisioning what you need. Then data transfer and backups, you can't overlook those expenses. So moving data between regions, or anytime you're moving data out of a region, is going to incur an additional expense. So replicating databases for high availability or backup or disaster recovery are going to, again, introduce those expenses. And then finally, licensing. It's often the most significant expense, particularly for those using SQL Server Enterprise Edition.
Can you talk about what are the strategies that businesses can use to reduce SQL Server licensing costs in the cloud?
One of the most effective ways is to use SQL Server Standard Edition whenever possible. So many businesses opt to use Enterprise Edition simply to use always-on availability groups for high availability and disaster recovery. But there are other options. You can build a SQL Server failover cluster instance with SQL Server Standard Edition, and that will eliminate the need for the Enterprise Edition licenses. But you have to take into account your storage options there. So things like SIOS Data Keeper will help you minimize the expense, and there are other shared storage options as well that let you build SQL Server failover cluster instances with SQL Server Standard Edition. But beyond choosing between Enterprise and Standard, you have to look at your license mobility. So again, Azure offers hybrid benefits and AWS offers license mobility, which basically lets you bring your on-premise SQL Server licenses as well as your Windows Server licenses. In the case of Azure, the Azure benefits will let you bring them into the cloud, so you're not paying per hourly fee for those licenses. And AWS, again, also lets you bring your SQL Server licenses into the cloud, so you don't have to pay as you go for SQL Server.
Can you also talk about what factor should influence the choice between self-managed SQL Server and cloud-managed services like Azure SQL managed instances?
So now we've been talking about infrastructure as a service, where you're managing and building your own SQL Server instances, but there are options in the cloud to have hosted SQL Server, or really any flavor of relational database platform that you choose. So to choose between those, one factor might be if you have legacy applications that rely on SQL Server features like cross database queries or SQL Server agent, then a self-managed SQL Server instance might be a better option. But if your organization, if you're trying to prioritize reducing the administrative overhead, then maybe a managed service like Azure SQL, managed instance, or others can simplify things like patching and backups and high availability. Performance and compliance are also other key considerations. So some businesses need full control over their SQL environment for performance tuning or regulatory compliances, and that's going to be more flexible with the self-managed SQL Server instance.
And can you also talk about how do cloud providers' pricing models affect SQL Server cost optimization strategies?
Yeah, cloud providers use different pricing models, and understanding them is going to be key to optimizing your SQL Server costs. So, pay-as-you-go pricing is going to be your most expensive option. Um, Only a really good option if you're not, if you only need them running on occasion. But if you have workloads that are always running, then you should really look at the reserved instances or savings plans to lock in those discounts. And again, storage costs are also going to be a big factor. So some workloads might benefit from using cheaper storage tiers or compressing data to reduce the footprint. And then, again, the network egress fees will really kind of catch you off guard if you're not anticipating that. So if you're replicating databases across regions for disaster recovery, you have to factor that into your monthly expense. And then the licensing model, Azure Hybrid Benefits, bring your own licenses, they all will significantly impact the total cost of the ownership. So you need to align your workloads with the right pricing model to help maximize your cost efficiency.
We have had this discussion earlier also, a balance between ensuring high availability and cost efficiency. Talk about how can businesses ensure high availability without incurring excessive cloud costs.
Yeah, so ensuring high availability on a budget, right, really requires some smart architecture choices and cost-conscious high availability solutions. One of the best ways to achieve that is using SQL Server Standard Edition and build a SANless cluster. So with SIOS Datakeeper, you could build a failover cluster instance using just regular cloud-based storage. So you don't have to opt in for any of the hosted storage solutions. It's basically going to help lower the cost of the storage as well as lower the cost of the SQL Server licensing versus the other option, which is always on availability groups, which again is going to incur the cost of the Enterprise Edition licenses. And then finally, right sizing your infrastructure. Don't over provision your virtual machines, and make sure that you're using the optimal size and optimal storage. And then when you're looking at multiple availability zone deployments, that's going to give you high availability, allow you to qualify for the 4 nines of availability in the cloud SLA, whereas the cross-region replication is going to be great for disaster recovery if you anticipate, you want to protect against an entire region failure, but you have to consider also the expense with replicating that data outside the region. So it really all comes down to what kind of disasters you're trying to protect against versus your budget for providing high availability and disaster recovery.
Dave, thank you so much for joining me today. And of course, once again, talk about cost cutting, cost saving. Actually, I don't like the term cost cutting, it's cost efficiency, which is the right approach. Thanks for sharing great insights. And as usual, I look forward to our next discussion. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Swan.